Hey guys, Jello here from Jello Photography, and today I'm going to talk about the basics of aperture. So what is aperture? Aperture is the opening is in digital photography. Aperture is basically the opening of the lens at which light travels through. Now depending on the lens, uh, the maximum aperture varies. Now we'll get into that later. Basically, in most cameras and in most lenses, the aperture can be changed. Meaning, if you just look at this one here, this is your aperture. Almost all lenses allow the user to change this aperture, meaning the user can change this opening to make it bigger or smaller. Right, now we have some terms for this. Basically, the maximum opening that the lens can go to is called its maximum aperture. And its opposite, the smallest opening they can go to, is called its minimum aperture. So that's just some terminology for people just starting out digital photography. But so you know what an aperture is now. So what is it used for? So if you think about it, imagine you have a tube, a hollow tube with which is open on both sides, right? And then you let water flow through it, right? We'll use water as an analogy to light. If you have a tube, let's say this big, the opening is this big, and you flow water through it, then water is gonna flow a bit fast, right? Quite efficiently. If say you use a different tube which is a bit narrower than before, then you will realize it makes sense that the water will actually slow down, meaning less water can go through at some time, right? So the same principle applies in optics. Basically, if we have a wide open aperture, meaning bigger opening, that means more light can go through much faster at a shorter time. If the opening is much smaller, then just like in the water case, less light can go through at any given point of time. So um, what do we use aperture for really? So keep that example in mind. So in photography now, let's say you're in a dark situation. Let's say you're in a low light situation, and then you want to capture that picture with just enough shutter speed, right? The first thing you can do is to open up your aperture, meaning make that opening bigger to let more light in. So that way you can get away with a faster shutter speed even though you're in the dark situation. Now one more effect that you get by having a big aperture or having a wide open aperture is that the bigger the opening, the shallower the depth of field. Now depth of field is basically the field at which everything is in focus. So let's say the things in between my hands, that's a depth of field, right? So imagine you are making the aperture bigger, meaning the opening is bigger. This depth of field here is gonna shrink like that, and then so the effect of that is gonna be those pictures where you have this subject here perfectly in focus, and then everything else is blurred. And I'm sure you've seen pictures like this in the past. And the opposite happens when you make the opening much smaller. If you have a very small opening, meaning a very small aperture, then what happens is your depth of field is going to be a lot bigger, meaning you're going to have more things in focus, right? You're going to have more things in focus, so your picture, if you take the same picture but with a narrower aperture, what you're going to get is the same picture, that subject in focus, but you are going to have less background blur. Now, so to demonstrate this, I am going to have this quick subject here, and I'm going to take a picture of it. Right, I'm going to take a picture first at f1.8. I'm going to talk about the f numbers next, so I'm just going to take this picture first. There. As you can see, the picture, I focused on the number 115, Freedom Zoom 115. As you can see, that is in f1.8, and this, and only that part of the picture is actually in focus. And you can see that everything else, as the farther you go back in the picture, the more blurry it gets. So you get more. That's what we call well, that's the blur. All right. So now I'm gonna take the same picture, but with a much higher aperture, say an f5.6. All right. Here we go. Okay. So as you can see, same picture. Again, I focused on number 115. It's still in focus, but immediately you will see the big difference, right? Compared to the first picture, this picture has significantly less background blur. I mean, it still has some blur, but it is considerably less than the first one. So there. So that's what happens. So that's the effect of having a wide open aperture versus a small aperture. So now you've seen how it goes, you've seen how it works. Now I'm going to show you how to actually set it on your camera. Okay, I'm using a Canon Rebel XS here. So assuming that you're a Canon user, this is how you do it. This is also going to work in other manufacturers. It's almost the same thing. I mean, Nikon uses A for aperture mode. Canon uses AV for aperture mode. So here, let me show you. So okay, I'm gonna start up program. So all you have to do is you switch to AV mode. That's gonna be that is the aperture mode on a Canon system. If you're using a Nikon or a Sony or any other DSLR camera, then it might be different, but it should be really close. Maybe A something, but it's really close. It's self-explanatory. So now you're in AV mode. Here, at least in this Canon here, you see this number, f1.8. Oops, sorry. Okay, f1.8. You see that? The way it goes in aperture is that the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. Right? I'll say that again. The smaller the f number, the bigger the opening. Right? That's just how it goes, because these numbers are not really whole numbers. These are actually fraction values. So you can imagine it's an f 1 over 1.8. So that explains. So that's why it's the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. If you think about it mathematically, it's gonna make sense. Oops, sorry, that was my phone. Now, so you can see then here, the bigger the f number, since this is a fraction again, right? The bigger the f number, then you should know this by now, then the smaller the opening, right? So I'll say that once again. The bigger the f number, the smaller the aperture opening. Okay? So that's that. That's the basics. That's basically all you have to know about aperture. And to really learn how to use aperture properly and to actually decide on which aperture to use depending on what situation, I suggest that you just go out, take a few pictures, maybe take a picture of a flower, set a small aperture first, then take the same picture with a bigger aperture and see the difference. I guarantee you will see a significant difference, and that way you will learn the effects. You will actually learn different effects on aperture, and you can start getting these cool pictures if you start using aperture. Start with aperture. I mean, aperture can be a really fun tool. Okay, so this has been a quick tutorial on apertures on DSLR photography. Hope you enjoyed it and learned something, obviously. Until next time, Have a great day.